Welcome to A Popular History of Unpopular Things, a mostly scripted podcast that makes history more fun and accessible. My kind of history is the unpopular stuff: disease, death, and destruction. I like learning about all things bloody, gross, mysterious, and weird. Just a quick reminder that you can support me and the show on Patreon. Just look up either A Popular History of Unpopular Things or APHOUT, APHOUT, and you can support me there. And you can also now watch episodes on YouTube, so go subscribe to my channel there. I appreciate all the love and support. So, I thought maybe I'd covered the last of the known cannibals of westward expansion era America, but I was apparently wrong, because today we're talking about a man who earns the nickname Liver-Eating Johnson. Many of you may not know who that is from the outset. I don't blame you, but some of you might recognize it or will have seen references to it in pop culture. For example, there was a movie in 1972, Jeremiah Johnson, which is based on this story. And if you send memes or reaction gifs to your friends, then you've probably used or seen a screenshot from this film. It's Robert Redford looking back towards the camera, grinning. He's got this ridiculous haircut. He's wearing brown leather, right? Go ahead and look up Jeremiah Johnson in Google Images, and it should be the first or second image. You've probably seen it. Now, the real person behind the film here was John Jeremiah Garrison Johnson, which is a man who, according to the story, deserted the armed forces during the Mexican-American War and then headed west to try his hand at digging for gold. He married a woman from the Flathead American Indian tribe, and when she was pregnant, some warriors from the Crow tribe killed and scalped her. In his vengeance, Johnson went on a one-man killing spree, hunting down and killing any Crow that he came across. And supposedly, he killed upwards of 300 of them, eating their livers, collecting their scalps. And after 25 years, he made peace with them and settled down to become this mountain man hero of legend. But this whole story, this whole legend might just be that. A story. A work of overly exaggerated fiction, only loosely based on the real history. So today, we're going to take a look at the story of John Jeremiah Johnson, the liver-eating, scalp-collecting, vigilante murderer. First, we'll look at the historical context to get a good sense of the world he lived in. And then, once we hear the story of liver-eating Johnson, we'll try to make sense of how much of it is fact and how much of it is fiction. Or if we can even figure that out with what little information can be corroborated. So let's get started. Now, for those of you who might be new to this podcast, the first thing I like to do with the topic is explore the historical context. What was happening in the world that led to this event? Or perhaps in this case, what did liver-eating Johnson's world look like? Did his environment lead him to becoming a cannibal crow killer? Which, by the way, sounds like a really good name for a metal band. Just putting it out there. Now, I'll keep the context somewhat brief, since I've already covered this general period of time many times, but it's important to know about westward expansion era America and the mountain men to understand liver-eating Johnson's world. So part of the trouble with this story is that it comes from what we can consider the heroic age of fur trappers and mountain men. Many of these guys, like Kit Carson, Buffalo Bill, not the serial killer from Silence of the Lambs, perhaps Hugh Glass, which is the guy that Leonardo DiCaprio played and won an Oscar for in the movie The Revenant. They were all legends, right? Whose stories grew over time to really romanticize the whole period. These stories championed the idea of a white trapper living amongst the indigenous, toughing it out in the wilderness, surviving the harsh realities of life in the untamed regions of the US. As folklorist Richard Dorson writes in the foreword to the new edition of the book Crow Killer, The Saga of Liver-Eating Johnson, quote, We know that the mountain men, living by their woodcraft in the remotest reaches of the continental United States, generated a vigorous oral lore. In their winter cabins and at their annual rendezvous, they ate fresh killed meat, drank whiskey, and talked endlessly of their own and their fellows' exploits. John Johnson is a product of this oral legend. End quote. And I'm not suggesting John Johnson isn't real, he was a real dude, but the legend associated with him most likely is not. So let's dig deeper into this mountain men era of westward expansion to get a sense of the world he lived in. The mountain men were fur traders and trappers that went out west in the early 19th century, that's the 1800s. So, for those of you who have been listening to my other episodes on this period of US history, that's the early days of westward expansion, before the Mexican American War, before the discovery of gold in California, before the heavy days of the Oregon Trail, before the Civil War, all of that. The earliest trappers went west in search of fur, particularly beaver fur, found in mountains and near mountain streams in the west, both in the US and Canada. And although the fur trade only made up a small percentage of the economy, the mountain men still helped contribute to the goods that North American ports could ship off to Europe. The fur industry was one of the earliest economies in the US, alongside things like whaling and fishing. Larger agricultural plantations like rice, indigo, and tobacco, they came a little bit later. So mountain men, following the fur, went west once Jefferson purchased the Louisiana Territory, and Lewis and Clark and Sacagawea explored those northwestern reaches. And as more trappers headed west, they built trading posts. Towns like Independence, Missouri, which later became a major starting point on the Oregon Trail. And then you've also got towns like Fort Laramie in today's Wyoming. Their peak years were from the years after the Louisiana Purchase to Western settlement. So think like 1806 to 1840. Those were the peak years for the mountain men. But not everyone was cut out for life as a trader on the American frontier. Its location meant interaction with local indigenous groups, which sometimes was fruitful and profitable, other times was violent. Relations between different indigenous groups was complicated enough before French and American trappers entered the picture. Being a fur trapper also meant being alone a lot. You needed to be skilled with woodcraft, hunting, tracking, and surviving in the woods. Many trappers were also pretty educated and spoke multiple languages, needing to converse with local populations and their indigenous languages, right? I mean, that makes sense. And contrary to the popular folklore image of the white, solitary man in the woods, decked out in furs, long bushy beard, long hair, scraggly looking maybe, not all of the trappers and traders were white. Some of them were escaped Southern slaves, and there were even a handful of women who were trappers and traders on the frontier. Now, these mountain men were not only among the first to explore the frontiers of the US, but they also helped establish justification a little bit later on for manifest destiny, because they had all of this valuable information and knowledge about the West. Clued in people in the East about what was really out there, right? American mountain men were there and they had conquered it, so the government should just move in and make it official, right? So these mountain men were legendary. They survived out in the wilderness. They were tough, smart, crafty, resourceful, solitary, mostly men. No wonder they became legends. And as oral accounts of these men were spread over time, they grew and became exaggerated. The mountain men became legendary heroes. Some because of their abilities, and others because of their struggles against the indigenous populations they sometimes clashed with. The subject of today's story falls into that latter category. Liver-eating Johnson's highly embellished story has become a legend for how he hunted down and killed the crow who supposedly wronged him by killing his Flathead wife. So let's get into who John Liver-eating Johnson was, how he ended up out west, what the traditional legend and story is, and then we'll see if we can read between the lines a little bit of this exaggerated oral history to get a sense of who he really was and why his story ended up sounding so fictional. And also, because of his name, I have to know, was he actually a cannibal? Ooh, quick tea break. First, I'll give the abridged story of John Jeremiah Liver-eating Johnson. He lived a long, interesting life and did a lot of stuff, but I'm just interested in the liver eating parts and how he got that name. So, after we learn the story and we go through the story, the abridged version, we'll dive into the sourcing and how that impacts the truth of the story and what the real history probably is. John Jeremiah Garrison was born in New Jersey in 1824, actually not too far away from where I am now. He was a pretty big dude at 6 feet 2 inches. The average at the time was only 5 foot 6. He enlisted in the Navy and served in the Mexican American War aboard a frigate, but he hit an officer and deserted. So, to help escape the potential fallout from that, he apparently changed his name to John Johnson instead of Garrison and went to Montana out west and decided to try his hand at digging for gold. His name actually started off as Johnston with a T, but over time it became Johnson. I don't know what happened to the T. I'm just going to simplify it and I'm just going to call him Johnson. So in Montana, he met and married his wife, a Flathead indigenous woman who was known as the Swan. And it's worth noting again that despite the narrative that many of these early trappers were constantly in battle with the indigenous folk, many actually had excellent relationships with them and sometimes melded into their society really well and probably had more in common with the indigenous than like East Coast white settlers. Just putting it out there. Johnson's marriage to his wife illustrates that. They lived in a log cabin in Montana for a while, making a living through trapping, hunting, and selling whiskey. They treated each other kindly. She taught him some of her flathand language. He taught her how to shoot rifles and all sorts of stuff to protect herself. The two ended up settling in a cabin on the Little Snake River in Wyoming, where she cooked for him and made him moccasins for the upcoming trapping season. By all accounts, a nice, happy marriage. When he left for trapping, she busied herself with hunting small game around the property. She was also apparently pregnant, but it's not like either of them knew that when he left for the winter to go trapping, or at least according to the story, neither of them knew. And then here's where things really kick off, right? One day, while out in the woodlands around their cabin, just looking for his return because it was close to the end of the trapping season, some Crow warriors saw her while they were coming downriver. So they snuck up on the cabin and up on her, killed her with a tomahawk to the back of the neck, and then scalped her. When Johnson returned from his trapping season, he first saw a vulture at the doorway to their cabin home. So after shooing the vulture away, he saw his wife, at least what remained of her, on the floor. Her skull had been picked clean by the vultures and whatever other little critters were around, so she was little more than a pile of bones at this point. The story also makes it clear that he saw, like, a little round, squishy mass on the floor, which was what had formed of the fetus by this point. So he knew at that point that he had an unborn child who was also murdered alongside his wife. Now, as a skilled hunter, trapper, and woodsman, he had a keen knowledge of the different indigenous groups of the area. He soon found evidence of where the crows had waited before ambushing his wife and was able to suss out that it was, in fact, crow warriors based off of what they left behind and a feather found at the scene. As a result, he swore vengeance on the crow, and this is when Johnson went around killing them, scalping them, eating their livers raw, apparently. And the implication was not survival cannibalism before you start worrying about that or thinking maybe, he was just doing it to survive in the wilderness. He was a skilled hunter and trapper, right? The man could find food. The eating the liver wasn't for survival cannibalism, it was the principle of it. It was getting revenge. And as he killed crows, his legend as the crow killer spread, and groups of crows would actually seek him out to kill him. But Johnson would still kill them, which kept the legend of this vengeful mountain man vigilante going. Sounds pretty convenient to me, to be honest. Like, I don't know, the plot to a movie, maybe? Now, despite being a tall, scary guy, he learned from and worked with other trappers quite frequently. First, a man named Old Hatcher, from whom he learned how to kill and scalp a man. He later ran around with a guy named Del Gue, from whom we get a lot of this story. Del was there for a lot of Johnson's adventures. For example, in the book Crow Killer, Dell tells the story that Johnson, in an argument, killed a Sioux brave just by hitting him once. And in the fight that ensued with other Sioux braves around him, he killed 5 of them with his fists alone. Dell also tells the story of how Johnson killed 2 indigenous men at once only by kicking them. My point is that he had a reputation for killing, and he was good at it, but that vengeance was only directed towards the indigenous. He apparently had never killed a white man, not even a French trapper, according to the story, which I love that they have to distinguish between white men and the French. But anyway, it's just, he killed a lot of indigenous men, according to the story, is my point. Now, soon after his vendetta started, he had earned the nickname Dapiek Absaroka, or Crow Killer, and then he became Liver-Eating Johnson, as each of his kills had a cut beneath the ribs and their livers removed. And as gold prospectors came out west, they heard these tales of Liver-Eating Johnson, which had helped spread them even more. He even became a boogeyman that mothers in western settlements would use to threaten their unruly children, that he would come and cut up and eat their liver. It's Mom of the Year award right there. Now, on one particular raid, he and some other mountain men came across a crow camp in the Bitterroots, which are mountains in Montana. And after killing many of the crows, the story goes that Johnson found and killed the man who killed his wife, the swan. He saw a scalp on that crow's belt and he just somehow knew that it belonged to his wife, which is suspect. So anyway, he scalped the guy and then he braided the hair of this guy's scalp with the hair that still remained on his wife's dried scalp, which is weird. And then he went off hunting more of the ones who supposedly were there killing his wife. The Crow, at that point, then decide that Johnson needs to be killed, so they sent 20 warriors off to hunt him down individually and kill him. Are you getting the sense that this is a bit too fictional and dramatic, exaggerated and bordering too closely on legend rather than fact? Because I sure am. Johnson killed the first 19 of the 20 Crow warriors individually sent out to kill him, which is weird, before joining the Civil War and fighting for the Union in February 1864, which was already 3 years into the war at that point. He was later honorably discharged in September 1865, and he headed back west to get back into trapping. Shortly after, he apparently killed his 20th Crow warrior who was sent to kill him, which at this point was way more than a decade after his wife was originally killed. According to legend, he killed almost 300 Crow men and boys over the span of 25 years, scalping each and consuming their liver. That's a lot of raw liver. That's a lot of cannibalism. But after the Civil War, you see, things were different out west. The fur trade was dying off, or at least slowing down as the main economy. It was never the main economy, you know what I mean. The whole trade was dying down. Indigenous lands were being taken. Conflicts between the settlers and the indigenous just weren't as prevalent. Johnson eventually sought peace with the Crows because the days of the mountain men frontiersmen living alone in the woods were just kind of over. Settlements were growing. Indigenous lands were being firmly taken by the American government. Times had changed. That whole rugged living out in the woods on the frontier thing was just kind of gone, or at least dying off. So, as historians, our job here is to figure out fact from fiction. How much of the story can we actually corroborate? Because if not, honestly, I'm not inclined to believe it. Well, what's interesting here is that most of the information about Liver-Eating Johnson's exploits comes from oral history. A lot from his trapping partner, Del Gue, and actually a lot from Liver-Eating Johnson himself. At some point, he kept embellishing his own story, making himself seem fantastical. Johnson, you see, used to attend and act in these Wild West shows, telling his story, making it seem more outlandish than it was. So, he's an unreliable narrator. much like H. Holmes was in his trial for murdering a bunch of people who got in his way in the late 1800s. That was a previous episode I did, so have a lesson if you haven't already done so. But the trouble here is that we have no real way of knowing how much of this story is real and how much is fiction. For example, we don't have proof that liver-eating Johnson ate livers. There's no proof of that. Sure, Delgue tells us that he did, but did he just say that to help give this man a legend? To help secure him as one of the great mountain men of his time? Because before the story was told, he wasn't considered one of the great mountain men of his time. Again, this is not something we can actually corroborate. We do know that many mountain men have embellished stories and tales. One article I read puts it well. The mountain man culture, if you will, lent itself to tall tales. They were fond of spinning exaggerated, boastful stories about one's exploits around the campfire. That's a good way of putting it. And over time, as more people add to the legend becomes fact. The narrative is completely muddied. The truth is lost to history. And what we have instead is embellished oral history that has become the newly accepted truth. The 1972 Jeremiah Johnson film doesn't help. It helps establish this narrative that he went on the vengeful warpath against the Crow for killing his wife and child, although in the film he has an adopted son, which isn't true. Now, the book I referenced earlier, Crow Killer by Raymond Thorpe and Robert Bunker, is considered to be the true story because it's based on interviews with the men who supposedly knew and worked alongside liver-eating Johnson. But again, some of these stories were embellished. So by the time they were told to Raymond Thorpe, they were already exaggerated versions of what actually happened. But then I did a little digging, and it actually gets worse than that. Chief Joseph Medicine Crow, who also served as the tribe's historian until his death, noted that the story we get about liver-eating Johnson is fiction. He says that there's no record of beef between the Crow and Johnson, and in fact, Johnson was considered friendly with their tribe, and they even shared raw deer liver together, not human liver. Now, as Dennis McClelland notes in his book, The Truth Finally Revealed, almost nothing from the book Crow Killer is historical fact. He was serving in the Navy at the same time that his wife was supposedly killed. So, did he even really marry the swan? Was he married at all? Because if he never married the swan, or if she didn't exist, then the entire premise of this story is just gone. Just throws the whole book out, right? It's all fake. Now, additionally, the Crow saw him as an ally, not a foe, which is what Joe Medicine Crow told us, right? Any conflicts that Johnson was in that we can prove were against the Blackfoot, the Sioux, or the Cheyenne, not the Crow. McClelland also notes in his search for the truth that he can't even corroborate Delgue's existence. Del is the source of information used in Crow Killer, but he only appears in one other source, a book by another of liver-eating Johnson's contemporaries, White Eye Anderson. And White Eye Anderson is the one who gave the Crow Killer authors information about Delgue. Now, if Del was actually real, these are all just interpretations of his experiences with liver-eating Johnson. They're not the words of liver-eating Johnson himself. It's all secondhand information, and as far as I'm concerned, it's not credible. And on the topic of cannibalism and liver eating, McClelland tracked down this article from the Billings Times, July 27th, 1899. Johnson was asked if he ever ate crow liver, and this is Johnson's response, quote, "It's a damned lie. I know I got that reputation, but 'tain't so. I'll tell you how 'twas. It was at the head of the Muscle Shell. It was back in '68. There was 15 of us, and we were hunting and making a wood camp. We was attacked by Injuns, and we licked 'em good. Harry Bear was the name of their chief. We killed 36 of them and wounded 60. I chased down one Indian, then I scalped him, then I ran my knife into him and killed him, and part of his liver came out with the knife. I waved the knife with the liver on it in the air and yelled, 'Come on and have a piece. It'll stay in your stomach till you get home to dinner.'" End quote. And from that, I suppose, the story grew that he ate livers. Now, if we go back to the foreword to Crow Killer, again written by Richard Dorson, he says, quote, "What we have here is the skeletal biography of a Rocky Mountain trapper and Indian fighter in the middle decades of the 19th century, retold primarily on the basis of word of mouth sources. Their annals belong to what may be called folk history, or saga in the Icelandic sense of family and local chronicles maintained by spoken recitals and filled with marvelous matter. The history of liver-eating Johnson has been kept going by this sort of saga. End quote. So, there we go. Much of the legend of liver-eating Johnson is really just that. A legend, a saga, a story to give the era of the Mountain Men even more prestige. And in the years after Crow Killer was published, and especially after the story was popularized by Robert Redford's portrayal of liver-eating Johnson in the movie, historians and other interested writers have been pouring through the history and debunking much of it. So, the really cool and gross story of a man avenging the murder of his wife by killing and scalping crow men and boys, then eating their livers, will have to stay as just that, a story, not historical fact. And if you go out there into the world reading or hearing about all kinds of stories that parade as truth, try to remember to read those stories and think critically about them, because everything inherently has bias, and stories can be easily fabricated, just like this one of liver eating Johnson, to tell a particular narrative. Thank you for joining me for this episode of A Popular History of Unpopular Things. My name is Kelly Beard, and I hope you've enjoyed the story of liver eating Johnson. Thank you for supporting my podcast, and if you haven't already checked out my other episodes, go have a listen. You can support me and the show on Patreon. Just look up A Popular History of Unpopular Things. And you can also subscribe to AF Out Now on YouTube. Be sure to follow my podcast, available wherever you listen, so you know when new episodes are dropped. And stay tuned to get a popular history of unpopular things.